Hi, welcome to the Winter Climate Justice panel. This is our second panel that North Seattle College is putting on. Thank you all for being here. We have a great selection of panelists for you coming up, so have your questions ready to send to them, and we're going to start with our program. Today, our land and labor acknowledgements are going to be read by DeAndre Fisher. We're so blessed to have him here. So DeAndre, please read our acknowledgements.
Absolutely. Greetings, DeAndre Fisher here. It is important that we recognize not only that this land acknowledgement is the space is not a new practice, but it's very important that we recognize that this land acknowledgement is just one action that we should take as an institution, as a community too as well. So with that being said, I'll read the land acknowledgement. It reads as follows. On behalf of North Seattle College, we acknowledge that we occupy the traditional ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish tribe. The people that are still here continue to honor and bring light into their ancient heritage. Without them, we wouldn't have access to this gathering, dialogue, and learning space. We ask that you take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land, air, and water who are still here today. We also want to take a moment, and it is very important to recognize what we know to be true is that the unpaid labor of many of our ancestors who identify in many groups have done. And I'll just read this part. We acknowledge the labor and the unforced labor, of our ancestors and our people that have been enslaved, that are the foundations of the US. And we also want to make sure that we acknowledge that they have not been compensated. We also acknowledge that it takes a collective of responsibilities to critically interrogate these histories, to repair the harm, and to honor and protect and sustain the land. I know that is not exactly what the PowerPoint says, but because I cannot read that, that's what I know to be true. So thank you, and Black Lives Do Matter, Black Lives Matters, and as well as Black Voices Matters. Thank you.
Thank you so much, DeAndre. And to keep moving along, we have Heather Price here, the Climate Justice Across the Curriculum Project faculty lead. Heather Price teaches chemistry and leads the Climate Justice Across the Curriculum Project at North Seattle College, and is co-PI on the National Science Foundation project titled Climate Justice in Undergraduate STEM Incorporating Civic Engagement. Heather also teaches in North's Undergraduate Research Program, UGR, a skills-focused program that allows students to conduct authentic research early in their college careers. Prior to joining NSC, North Seattle College, Heather worked as a climate scientist at the University of Washington program on climate change, studying and incorporating isotopes of hydrogen into a global chemical transport model to determine the impact of hydrogen on climate and atmospheric chemistry. Heather earned their PhD in chemistry, building and using atmospheric chemistry instruments to research the transport and photochemistry of air pollution. Heather is also on the leadership team for Seattle 500 Women Scientists and is a co-founder of the Community Climate Justice Resources Hub, talkclimate.org, with fellow climate scientists, mental and medical health professionals, artists, and youth climate activists. Welcome, Heather, and please let us know where your brain goes.
Oh, capturing where my brain goes is a hard thing to do. Thank you so much, Shakira, for organizing this, and to the faculty who have been doing this work. And so you can see on the slide that there's these workshops that faculty, so that Deepa and Tracy and Paula and Caroline, and we've now got 33 faculty who have gone through and created climate justice or woven climate justice into their classes. And this isn't standalone classes. These are lessons that are within their classes. What we're finding, and I want to share, because the research that Sonia Doucette and I are doing, we just got some results back. This is like hot off the presses from our evaluator at NSF from, I'm not kidding, like 4 days ago. So Shakira, go ahead to the next slide. And I also want to reiterate, our students want this in their classes. And so this is a quote from Shia Bastida. I share this in all of the workshops that Sonia and I run, just to illustrate that the students want this done, they want it in their classes. And we're starting to see that in the results from students who have gone through and are getting our lessons in their classes. So next one, and these are some of the civic engagements, and we'll come back to this slide. You can look at these. So if you're trying to figure out how do I engage my students, how do I get civic engagements and community engagements into my classes, not just the climate justice, which, right, it's rooted in that, but just like a doctor isn't going to just give you how you're being harmed, the test results, the science, part of what the civic engagement piece is giving our students and ourselves the tools to heal and repair and to do the work. Next slide, Shakira. And then these are a number of the lessons that faculty have been creating. This includes faculty at here at North, at Bellevue College, which has been doing this since about 2018, and then also University of Washington. There's now 22 faculty that have gone through these workshops to incorporate it, to weave climate justice and civic engagement into their classes. Next slide. And so this is what is so interesting to me. When students are asked, and this is before they've even had a climate justice lesson, what issues are you most concerned about in the world today? These are their top 3 choices. And these are students who are STEM students at Bellevue College and at North Seattle College in chemistry classes. And what they say is number 1 is climate change. Number 2 is racial inequality. And number 3 is mental health. So our students are concerned about the things that bring together climate justice, racial justice, and these, right, and the ways to address these are through those civic and community engagements. Next slide. So this is a question that we ask them in the surveys. Do you feel like these top 3 identified issues are taught and or addressed in the courses you've taken? 58% of our students say no, that they're not taught. And again, this is a pre-survey that they've taken. Next slide. Is it important that your top issues of concern are taught and integrated into your courses? 79% of our students want this, right? Shia Bastida's quote about wanting intersectional, right? All of those pieces in our classes. The students want it. Next slide. Learning about climate justice in my science or math course increased my motivation to learn science or math. 83% of our students say yes. And so for me, this really brings home that even in our STEM courses, students want to have climate justice and these social justice issues, and it's motivation for them to continue. And I think that this is something that our colleagues in the arts and in humanities, you're ahead of us on this compared to STEM, at least ahead of me. And so I feel like this just confirms that students want to learn through these kind of equity ethics and those ideas. Next slide. And then civic action. So we asked students, did you participate in a civic action or impact policy, something to impact policy? You know, did you vote? Did you register to vote? Contact a public official by phone, mail, email to tell you how you felt? Did you volunteer or raise funds, right? Were you civically engaged? And this was part of the survey that we asked students. And most of our students, you can see, right, they're not very engaged. They're maybe once or twice a year. 40% said that they've done this. 20% say they do this every few months. 23% have never volunteered but would like to. 44% have never participated in a civil rights organization, but they would like to. And then in yellow, you can see time, safety, and knowing how to get involved. These are the most cited barriers that we saw in our surveys for why students are not engaged. And then next slide. And then through our courses, right, this is a post survey. Since you've done a civic engagement activity in this course, we ask them, to say whether they disagree or agree with this statement. I intend to get more involved in my community and in supporting causes I care about. For instance, example, protest, voting, talking about issues, joining civil rights or political action groups or social media campaigns. 72% said that they agree or strongly agree with this statement, that since they did a civic engagement activity in their course, they intend to get more involved, right? So we're giving our students the tools so that they can heal and repair and connect with their communities and connect it to what they're learning in their classes. Next slide. And next, we'll go back to Shakira and we'll meet our panelists. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Heather, for that information and the data that's being brought to us to show what students are wanting in climate justice and how we can incorporate that into higher academia. And eventually, hopefully, we can get up to K through 12. Next up, thank you so much for having our panelists here today. We have Deepa, Bhandaru, and they use she, they pronouns. They're social justice and intersectional studies. And Deepa is a social justice and intersectional studies faculty member at North. They teach courses in humanities, American ethics, ethnic studies, and gender and women's studies. Thank you, Deepa, for being here.
Thank you, Shakira, for organizing this, and for all of the work that you're doing to spotlight, I think, not just social justice work, but how all of these different things intersect. I think it's cool that the Indigenous Climate Justice panel that you organized a couple weeks ago was super inspiring. So, my name is Deepa. I use she or they pronouns, and I teach American ethnic studies, gender studies, and humanities courses here at North. And I went through the Climate Justice Faculty Institute in the fall. So I am pretty new to incorporating a specifically climate justice focus in my courses. And so this is the first quarter that I have devoted a module to climate justice in the American Ethnic Studies course that I'm teaching. And the focus of that module is on decolonization. So I'm trying to get students to think about how we decolonize climate and environmental justice. And so to give you a little sense about what that means. So Indigenous people all over the world, including here in the Americas, have cared about land and have cared about issues of, the climate and the environment since time immemorial. But when we typically think about the environmental movement or the movement against climate change, which really saw its origins in the 1960s, the faces that come to mind are white. So a lot of folks, like for me, when I was in college, I read the book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. And Rachel Carson was a scientist. She was a journalist, a writer. She was also a white woman. And at that same time, there were communities of color who were already on the front lines because they had to be. So in 1968, there was a famous strike that was led by sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee. It was one of the last, or probably the last battle that Dr. Martin Luther King got involved with. And a lot of people don't think about that strike as an environmental justice or climate justice strike. But in many ways it was already sort of kind of pre-envisioning this intersectional approach to the environment. All of the sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee were Black. Black people have been forced to do this work. DeAndre brought our labor acknowledgement in, have been forced to work with toxic substances since the founding of this country. And in advocating for their communities and advocating for the rights of workers, they were also advocating for a clean and healthy environment for all. And so part of decolonizing climate and environmental justice is about shifting how we understand these things and really centering the activism, the art, the values, and the relationship to community and land that Indigenous people and other communities of color, specifically Black and Latinx people, because I think in the United States, especially in the 20th century, these are the communities that were really at the forefront of pushing our consciousness, like here on this continent, towards a more like decolonized vision. So that's what I have been trying to kind of learn more about myself. I've spent a lot of time thinking about labor struggles and thinking about struggles for gender justice and economic justice and racial justice, but now really focusing on the struggles of communities of color, of women, of gender nonconforming people, and thinking about how those struggles also link up to the environment. And of course, there's the protest that took place in 2016 at the Standing Rock Indian Reservation, which I believe has just blown open how we think about climate justice today. If Indigenous communities are not at the center of this conversation and the struggle, because they are really at Indigenous communities and other communities of color, they live where the extractive industries are happening. Their lands, their neighborhoods are the spaces where landfills, where pipelines, where resources are being extracted and nothing is being put back in, right? And so we who are not there on the front lines, like what I think was beautiful about Standing Rock was you saw people from all over the country and the world to some extent flock to this space to walk behind Indigenous leaders, right? And that's precisely what MLK did with the Memphis sanitation workers. And I think that that's what, decolonizing climate justice, for me, from the perspective of, American ethnic studies, gender studies, that's really what it involves and what I'm trying to showcase in my courses.
Thank you so much, Deepa, for sharing the history too, and giving little nuggets of information that helps individuals understand the long history they have in this fight for climate justice. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Our next panelist is Carolyn Pugh. They go by she, her, and they are a Seattleite born and raised. She's a queer social justice advocate, abolitionist, educator, and climate scientist. Working at the intersections of justice, education, and community engagement, Caroline strives to create educational experiences which draw herself, colleagues, and students closer to their own humanity and authenticity by honoring the unique lived experiences that each person brings to the learning space. Caroline has nearly 20 years of experience in various forms of education. She is currently a tenured chemistry faculty development coordinator, and chemistry department co-coordinator at North Seattle College. Caroline also has worked as a STEM education technologist at Cascadia College and teaches for the University Beyond Bars program, which provides access to higher education for incarcerated individuals at the Monroe Correctional Complex. She is passionate about access and equity and STEM education. Welcome, Caroline. Thank you for being here.
Hey, thanks so much. And I feel like, Deepa, you really nailed it with so much of what you were sharing there. And I appreciated how you brought labor and labor issues into this conversation, because you all might notice I'm wearing my union blues today, because I'll be leaving in just a few minutes to go to contract negotiations for our union. And I feel like that connection is so important, because the same systems and structures that allow for the exploitation of human and labor rights is the same kind of systems that are in place that allow for exploitation of the environment, and that there are certain communities, particularly BIPOC communities, Indigenous communities, that are disproportionately impacted by that exploitation. And so I think it's really important that we understand that these are all interconnected parts of a system that's really more about exploitation and extraction of resources and capitalism, and less about really taking care of both our human and non-human, living and non-living relatives. And that's definitely a concept that is very strong in many Indigenous communities, because people have for centuries lived in connection with the land, because they relied directly on the land they were living on for their resources. And this disconnection in a global capitalist economy from the environment that we live in and live with, to feeling like there are these commodities that come from somewhere we don't even necessarily have reference of where they're coming from. So that interconnection between climate justice and social justice in the larger context. My dogs agree. You might be hearing them squeaking in the background. So I teach chemistry, and a lot of times, as you know, Heather was pointing out, STEM is a little bit behind in terms of that traditionally STEM fields have actually prided themselves on objectivity and neutrality and this separateness from the environments in which we live, to the point that for some scientists historically, it's been actually seen as stigmatizing to come out and speak up for climate change, because it's seen as not being neutral. And this concept of neutrality is actually a way of kind of covering a lack of engagement or ability to acknowledge these structures that do exist that need to be dismantled. And so as a STEM educator, I feel like it's so important for me to bring this work into my classrooms to kind of break down that concept that we are just these neutral, objective observers outside of something, as opposed to relationally part of the environment, and that we, you know, are all part of this system that can either raise people up and, you know, protect the environment and live in harmony with it, or that can serve to oppress and disproportionately impact various different groups. So I think that we need to shift the narrative as STEM educators to stop glorifying this concept of neutrality, which really just allows injustice to persist. So that is kind of what I'm interested in my classrooms. And I feel like Deepa really said it best. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Caroline, for sharing, and thank you for being here. The next panelist we have is Paula Rebsom, artist, mother, educator, trickster. All of these identities inform Paula's interdisciplinary visual art practice, which includes making sculptures from wood and fabric, site-specific installations, and image-based work using motion sensor cameras. She's always had an interest in science, specifically wildlife ecology, and applies elements of that to her work. Paula is currently full-time faculty in the art department at North Seattle College. Her work has been exhibited in group shows across the United States, including New York City, Philadelphia, Miami, Los Angeles, along with solo exhibitions at the Art Gym in Portland, Oregon, Gallery of Contemporary Art in Colorado Springs, and Soil Gallery in Seattle. She has also awarded residencies at the U Cross Foundation in Wyoming and the DeRossi program in California, and is recipient of numerous grants and awards. She lives with her husband, daughter, and Radar, the dog, in Seattle, Washington. Welcome, Paula.
Thank you so much. I appreciate being here with all of you and all your work organizing this. You may hear the dog or the child at any point. So, well, it's great to be here, as I had said, and I feel so honored to have the opportunity to be a part of this conversation, and also to have access to the Climate Justice Institute that Heather and Sonia both put together. I'm a visual artist, and so I'm going to do a slide share in a moment here to sort of help ground me in my conversation. But it just was really nice to be a part of this. So I'm going to share, because that actually segues into this. Are you able to see the screen?
Yes, we are. Thank you.
Great. So I was able to take this opportunity to join the the Faculty Justice Summit in order to take things that I was already interested in incorporating into my curriculum, but actually naming them, what I was sort of interested in trying to do. I had always kind of skirted around the issues of students being very conscious about materials that they were choosing. I was mostly talking about it from a health and safety standpoint, thinking about the toxicity of materials, and sort of what we access via that. But I had never sort of really named it in specific terms, and also named it in terms of thinking about climate justice and just sort of making students more aware of the decisions that they make and also the impacts that they can have. And so I was excited for this opportunity so that I just didn't have an excuse anymore not to name them, and to kind of call out publicly what I was doing that I was sort of hoping they were subconsciously getting. Like, I'm just going to name it. I want them to be aware of this, and I want them to be thoughtful of it. And, in the arts, oftentimes, when I was taught with sort of more traditional materials and techniques. And I was taught that, like, you have to, work with wood. And so you have to, go and buy a bunch of new lumber because recycled lumber can be dangerous because of nails and all that. And so I, come from this place of thinking, well, that's what I have to do. But then I see all this, beautiful new wood, and it's kind of turned into okay projects. Like, I just don't know that that's necessary. So,
Paula, I hate to interrupt, but we're not seeing your PowerPoint. We're seeing a week 6 document. I just want to make sure that we're seeing the
thing. Thanks. That's not what you want. Can you see that? There,
yes, material consumptions. Thank you.
So I'll use this as a grounding place. I have an assignment that I've done, which is I have students choose items that they were about to throw away, either recycle, compost, or throw away. I have them choose one, and then I have them remake it and enlarge it in scale. And it's one of my favorite projects. And as you can see, my students have an amazing time. They collectively really love this project. So I was using this as an opportunity to then think more in depth about the way that I was presenting the project. So let me skip forward. So these were a couple examples of some projects that I've gotten out of students. And if you notice, like, the one in the middle is made out of cardboard, and that's fantastic. But what I was realizing was, through this process of trying to subconsciously get students to think about consumption and material consumption, I wasn't having them think about the materials they were using. So, for example, this really funny and giant orange peel that's hanging out by the compost is actually made of spray foam. And that was I didn't really want that as part of it. So I'm thinking much more intently now with this project about getting students to research the materials they are using, to think about the toxicity of them, and to think about the end life cycle of them as well. Are you able to recycle this when completed, or what will you do with the project? I'm thinking very much about this project as the individual versus the collective. And on the left, this is an example from Mary Mattingly, who cataloged all of her belongings individually and then collectively bundled them up together. And you can see the impact of many small items collectively coming together as she drags the weight and the burden of these materials. And so individual and collective is so interesting to think about in so many ways. So these individual items collectively coming together. The same thing happens with my students. They all make these individual projects, and in their own rights, they're interesting and amazing. But then we collectively put them together, and they sort of tend to have much greater impact when you're seeing them as a whole. So visually, it just has more impact, but also thinking about the sort of consumption of these items and sort of where they may end up eventually. So there's this really beautiful component to that within this project that will definitely be saved and will continue to be showcased even more as part of the civic engagement, presenting this work sort of more formally and leaving it up for longer periods of time so that more groups of people can see the projects themselves. On the left, this is an example from the artist Coulter Fussell, who uses only donated fabric and clothing in their work. So I incorporate lots of examples of artists that are already doing this. This isn't reinventing the wheel. Lots of artists are thinking about this. So I want them to think more about life cycle of materials. And so they're going to be asked to research the material that they're using. Where does it come from? Where is it resourced from? What are the sort of ramifications of using it? Who does it impact? Is it draining a resource? Is it recyclable? So it's all those kinds of different things. And this is my conclusion slide. And what I love about this is that it happened to be another one where we installed it collectively, and it has the posters on the windows of the Grove talking from the Flat Earth Club and the Women in Science and Engineering. So a couple other things that I think are really valuable about this beyond thinking about the sort of climate and social justice is I think that it also expands students in terms of the scope of the work that they make. Students in making sculpture often are limited by this idea of what will I do with it when I'm done? And so they tend to go smaller or not really sort of push the project, or they try to make it functional instead of just visual. So they can work larger in scale because of the materials. Access, it's a lot quicker actually to get recycled and sort of thrifted materials these days than waiting for a shipment of materials to arrive because of transport. Material costs are often more affordable. And then it also really helps students redefine what the value of art is, whether the value is in the material or whether the value is in the ideas and the concepts that are presented. So I think, so I was just really excited for this opportunity to help reframe this, to just think more intentionally about it, to just let the students know that that's my goal, and that I want them to be more conscious and aware of that. And I want to be able to do that much sooner in their education instead of it being the sort of second thing that they learn. I want them to start thinking about recycled materials from the start, or the materials that they're choosing, instead of it being the afterthought. So thank you.
Thank you, Paula. You're doing some phenomenal work in the collaboration between the arts and climate justice. So I love seeing this, and just having the art students, think back about what materials they're using and what impact can cause. I think that's a great message. So thank you for doing the work that you're doing. Next up, we have, you're welcome. Next up, we have Tracy Furutani, he, him, and physics faculty. Tracy is a physics instructor at North Seattle College. He has also taught earth and environmental sciences, as well as chemistry. His dissertation work at the University of Washington was a study of fossils from the last time ocean levels were as high as they are today. He was recently elected to the Lake Forest Park City Council, where he will work to develop a climate action plan for the city and help to implement some climate mitigation legislation. Welcome, Tracy.
Hi, thank you, Shakira, for having me. I didn't really have any prepared remarks because I didn't realize that was part of the deal here. So I feel really terrible because everybody's done such a great job of describing how they're doing stuff. For my part, I will just describe the experience I had with Caroline, who's not here anymore. We teach a class called, it's the Science of Natural Disasters. Science 121, which will be offered next quarter, in fact, if anybody's interested. The thrust of the course, of course, is to get people to think about natural disasters and how it may affect them. But recently, in the past year or so, we've really had a shift to how do natural disasters affect populations, and especially populations on with not the ability to recover. So basically, lower socioeconomic, BIPOC communities, so forth. And the point is that yes, we all know that the effects of natural disasters are very disproportionate in terms of how different communities are affected. And so, one of the great things that has happened over the past, I would say, about 10 years is the amount of data that's available out there that shows basically where people live, how much they make, what kind of resources they have access to, where are the hospitals, that kind of stuff. On these geographic information systems has made teaching this class a real dream, because you can really get the intersectionality between climate justice and just literally scientific data like sea level rise and things like that. So what we try to do in our class is then have a civic engagement component by having, and we just did this because it just seemed fun, had the students prepare posters there, and they were representing different interest groups of a city. And we happened to pick Aberdeen, which is out on the coast of Washington. And it's got basically a fairly typical profile for most cities, basically fair amount of poverty, fair amount of basically geographic distribution of different populations. And so the point was that we had people represent, for instance, the homeless coalition there. We had people represent the prison union there. We had people represent city staff. And the idea was they would present a poster to the city council, which was Caroline and me, to say, okay, lobby for basically the climate mitigation strategy you'd like to see the city take in the next 4 years. And, if you can come up with a price tag, that's even better. That wasn't a required part, but it did open a lot of people's eyes about how much some of this stuff costs. But the point was then they could advocate for the group that they were talking about. And it was really neat because basically a lot of ideas that Caroline and I had never thought of came up through there. And in fact, one group, the people who were doing the prison guards union, actually really got involved with a lot of prisoner reintegration into society kind of work, which I thought was really kind of a cool fallout from that. So the point is that basically the intersection between science, climate justice, and activism is it's not a hard one. I ran for city council just because I didn't think that it was a good look on my city that we didn't have a climate action plan. We have 8% PhDs and 20% master's degree holding people in my city, and we don't have a climate action plan. How is that smart? So the point is we have the expertise. I think it was just a matter of basically kicking a few butts and basically making people do things. So you're right. I agree with the comments that were made about neutrality. Neutrality is often a cover for not doing something, right? I want to contrast that to objectivity, which we do want to strive for when we set up an experiment, because confirmation bias is a big problem, right? If you are looking for something that's going to happen, you'll probably find it if you put your mindset that way, right? So you got to be careful about that. But neutrality, you're right. Basically, that's something that just is, an excuse. So I'm hoping that by the end of my term that we will actually have a climate action plan in the city that will have involved the input from not just basically the members of the PhDs and the master's people, but everybody in the community, including basically some of the parts of our city that aren't represented very well. So to that end, one of the things I want to learn from all you here is basically how do you engage basically the people who are in the back of the room? In other words, the ones that aren't talking, right? How do you even figure out some of the people who aren't even in the room, right? Okay, what might their concerns be? So I'm really looking forward to learning from all of you. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Tracy. And as you can see today, we have an amazing group of panelists that are out front doing the work, not only in the classroom, but civic engagement, expanding their knowledge and continuing to share it with our community. So thank you all for all the work that you're doing, and please continue and looping in. And Tracy, to go on your question, that's a great question. So let's start with that question. I know it's not in our presentation right now, but that's a great question. How do you loop in those people that are in the background or that you don't know aren't listening or are listening? What are some strategies that you all use in your daily lives and your academic lives to help bring those people in?
One of the things that stood out to me from going through the Climate Justice Faculty Institute is this method of climate conversations, sort of starting with really low-hanging fruit. And I think it's actually not just applicable to climate change, but really to sort of it's how all social struggle begins. People have to talk about it. And the best way to talk about it is really peer-to-peer, friend-to-friend, family-to-family, within your sphere of influence, right? Identifying, who do you know? What matters to them, right? And how do I connect this thing that matters to me to something that matters to them, right? And Heather had a couple of videos about this because when when I went through it, it was last fall. This was like right around the time that the annual UN Climate Summit was meeting. So like these conversations were kind of being encouraged around the COP26 summit. And this is what I just implemented in my class, like this quarter. So one of the assignments is to have students just like take something that they've learned and share it, have a conversation about climate justice and racial justice and the intersections, like with someone in their community. And it could be a higher level policymaker, but really I'm just encouraging like coworker, like tap them on the shoulder during break and tell them like, I watched this video, you know, instead of telling them about the Netflix show you watched, tell them you watched this video about by Winona LaDuke at Standing Rock and talking about how we need to end, you know, our dependence on fossil fuels. And what do you think about that? You know, so that's one way, but I'm still like, the jury's out. I don't know how it's going to go. They're like on it this week and it could be a disaster and I could get a lot of like bad reviews. So.
Anybody else want to jump in with that before we move on to the first question for our panelists? I want to make sure there's space for that too. Thank you, Deepa. Go ahead, Paula.
I think I would just sort of honor everything that Deepa said, which is like, I had a lot of fear in bringing this topic up into my classrooms. I tend to like to be jazz hands and, you know, all great stuff. And I think that this is also for me, just this opportunity to kind of open it up and see what happens. And there's that sort of vulnerable space. And also like failure is part of learning. And so, you know, we're educators and we take that and we, you know, we tweak it a little bit and then we see, and then we do it again. And then we see what happens through that. And, you know, it'll get there eventually. Like it might not be the best in that first round, but you'll take the like 2 positive experiences that students report. Maybe you'll have more actually, but then you'll take those and you'll say like, well, what worked with those? And then, you know, so I think that is also part of why I appreciated having this sort of collective community of support and people who are already doing this to kind of then take that and say, what can I do differently, or just the courage to try it in that first place. So I just sort of resonate with a lot of what Deepa said. So
go ahead, Tracy.
Well, to sort of answer my own question, then one of the things that I thought was the most interesting was, you know, when you're getting elected, you have to doorbell. That literally going to people's doors you don't know, knocking on the door, and then trying to engage them in a conversation about something they probably don't want to talk about. And I was thinking, what an awesome way to deliver education this would be. I come to your door, and I'm going to tell you something about physics and climate justice right now, you know. And the really surprising thing to me was after that initial barrier of entry on both of our parts, right? Because you're talking to somebody strange and it's pandemic times and all that stuff. It really actually, the conversation would flow with a lot of people that basically, if you started talking about climate and aren't the trees here suffering as a result of this really hot summer we just had, man, people would just go off on their own tangents, and whether they were conservative or liberal, it didn't matter. Basically, that was the one thing that everybody was noticing. And that way, basically, there was always a lead into further conversation. So I thought that was kind of neat. It's too bad that we just can't do that with, you know, our regular day jobs here, right? Just walk up to people's doors and say, okay, we're going to tell you a little bit about this, you know.
And what I'm really hearing here is connection, like being able to connect with people about the issues. Everyone has spoken about connection. And so I think that's something that we tend to forget about too, of like, oh, there's this big issue we have to talk about it, and it is intimidating and we don't know where to start. And a lot of our students don't know where to start, how to get engaged. And it just comes to a simple conversation to have, like Deepa had stated. So thank you all for bringing your knowledge to that. And thank you, Tracy, for asking the question. How do you approach the issue of climate justice from your current disciplines when you teach your students about climate justice, and what do you do to emphasize that? So some of you have kind of touched on this already, and some of you haven't touched on it. So I'd just like to open the floor for those who haven't touched on this to bring to light how you're incorporating this.
I'm happy to start on this one. So I teach chemistry, and I've been working to incorporate climate justice into my chemistry classes. We do lots of examples, lots of word problems. And so one way that I do it is take, for instance, Henry's Law. Those of you who are taking chemistry, you will know what I'm talking about. But it basically, I used to use fish tanks to teach about Henry's Law and the oxygen and how it dissolves into water, right? Or a pop can for how carbon dioxide dissolves into the soda. And now I'm using climate justice examples like the impact of temperature changes on rivers and how we're seeing these, right? We had a heat dome event in the Northwest this summer, right? That impacted not just people, it was the deadliest event, right? And it's not a natural event. It's a fossil fuel climate exacerbated event. But it's also impacting our salmon, our rivers, and the people who depend on the salmon. And the other creatures that we share this world with, orcas, and so just that ripple effect and how it impacts place and people, and particularly the indigenous tribes that depend on the salmon, right? The salmon people. And so that's just one example from my class, but I try to weave it throughout.
I would just add one other thing. I think from like the perspective of just from social science in general, I think like from the perspective of ethnic studies and gender studies, really centering the activism, the resistance, the sort of action, the science, the knowledges, the skills, the arts of communities of color, indigenous nations, women, LGBTQ plus people, gender non-binary people, who all are on the front lines of the current struggles for climate justice, both here in the United States and globally. But I also, when I've taught political science classes, because my PhD is actually in political science, it's in political theory, but one of the interesting things about climate justice is the diversity of tactics that activists and actors are using to advance this, right? So, I mean, we see here, I bet if we asked each person, all of our panelists, we're seeing lots of different things, right? So we have Tracy who has run for office and is pursuing that path, right? You have people who are filing lawsuits, who are using the court system, right, to advance how our Constitution even thinks about the earth, right? So corporations used our political system to get peoplehood, right? That happened, and now corporations are seen as individuals. Well, there are some really awesome activists and lawyers who are getting the earth this kind of personhood in our legal system. So actually, where I grew up in the Great Lakes area, there are folks who tried to sue to get Lake Erie classified as like a living creature that is being contaminated and harmed, right? And so this actually brings a more indigenous understanding of the non-human environment into our legal system. Very different from probably what our founding fathers imagined the law would be used for, but disruption comes in all ways. And so that's also something that's I think interesting, is to think about like this is such a diverse topic, and there are so many different ways that activists are resisting, and also that scientists are looking at this issue.
Deepa, you raised some really great questions and points that thinking outside of the box on how to use the Constitution and the laws that were written, how to get around that, like finding the loopholes to get this put in writing so that we can get the earth protected. So thank you for bringing that up. Let's go ahead and move on to question number 2. So sometimes climate justice pedagogy can feel preachy and overly ideological. How do you introduce climate justice in classroom settings in ways that encourage critical thinking? Tracy, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, this is a problem that comes up because you want to be as natural as you can. In other words, make it an authentic experience. And so just sort of shoehorning something in is not necessarily the best way to go. So one of the things that, I do in my classes is, for instance, in Physics 223, where we talk about optics, essentially how light interacts with matter. This is a good lead into basically what are the techniques that are available to look at different kinds of materials with different kinds of light and that kind of stuff. And there's a wonderful little device that's been invented to basically count cells. It essentially shines light through a glass tube, and the way in which the light disperses, in other words, scatters, goes every higgledy-piggledy way, and measuring that tells you something about the stuff that's inside there, like how many cells, for instance. Well, it turns out some clever people have actually gotten to use that for microplastics that are in the ocean waters. And microplastics, as some of you know, is a big issue because basically it gets into all kinds of living creatures and is a persistent thing and may cause basically changes in cellular structure, for instance. So the point is that it affects the health of the oceans and, of course, the people that eat such things. So when we talk a little bit about that, because it is related to the physics topic, and then I have a demonstration where I can show basically, okay, so, and this is legit because I was able to get some water from off of the coast of Peru versus the water off of our coast here. And there's so much more of it in the Peruvian waters than there is in our waters. And I point out, okay, so what do you think basically the effects on these two countries would be, us versus Peru? We both rely on fishing off our coasts, and we both basically have lots of people who eat the fish off our coasts. Who do you think would affect more? And it's that next step that comes authentically from the science that was behind it that I think really engages students. So that's one of the things that I try to do, is basically see if I can, use the technique on different parts of the world, because that's the simplest thing to do, right? And be able to show that there is a disparate effect.
So I think I can also jump in on this question. I think I have an advantage in the visual arts in that, I can show examples of artists that, as I said, have already sort of forged this path and can get students interested in that through that channel, because a lot of students come with one idea of what art is or what art can be. And so I'm able to, just through the act of showing them examples of professional artists and local artists that are already thinking this way, it opens up, it expands their knowledge greatly. So that's one easy way that I'm able to do that without sort of preaching about it. And I also, as I said on my sort of conclusion slide, really believe that when you're using materials that are quicker to work with, that are inexpensive, that are readily available, and I am thinking primarily about cardboard, which is a material that we use a lot of in my classroom. It gets people thinking about building and about space and about shapes and forms, but in a quicker way and in a way where they're not processing value with the materials. But then we can add that extra layer, and we can talk about how this is different built out of cardboard versus built out of wood or something else. Or I think about my students just got done doing a bunch of soap carvings. So reductive carving using soap as a material, which is also way cheaper and more inexpensive and quicker to carve than if you were to use wood or marble. So you don't have to spend all those materials. But then I get to add on that layer. So I get to say, this is quick and cheap and easy to work with. But then I can say, well, what is this tube of lipstick that you carved? How is it different?
All right, welcome back to the panel. Let's keep going with our discussion. So question 4, how can the community get involved with climate justice at the grassroots level?
All right, I'll go since nobody's going. All right. There's a lot of different ways. For instance, on campus, we have an environmental club, and it's run by student services, and it's not an affinity group. I think they're still called clubs, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, Shakira. Okay.
We have clubs and we have affinity groups. So,
right.
Yes.
And I always wanted to see sort of an intersectionality between those. And there are basically club and affinity group fairs and things like that. And I think there's some really good things that could happen there. In your own community, there's groups like People for Climate Action and the League of Women Voters Conservation subcommittee, I guess they're called. But the point is that there's a lot of civic organizations like that that basically support educating people about climate justice. And they've really actually taken a hard turn towards climate justice and not just about climate change, which I thought was kind of an interesting thing I've seen in the past 2 years. And one of the real missed opportunities of the environmental movement was basically how white it's been. And the point is that engaging communities of colors really become even a thing for the Sierra Club, which I thought I would never see, but that's happening. So that's another way to get involved. And finally, even within, if you're not like working with these big national organizations, there are local organizations. Like in my city of Lake Forest Park, there's the Lake Forest Park Stewardship, which is literally a group of civic-minded people who get together and talk about the health of the streams, what we can do to monitor basically what's going on along the streams, do salmon counts, and really try to reach out to the schools in the area, especially the elementary schools, and try to get the next generation of people involved in these kinds of things. So there's many different levels at which you can find some civic engagement.
I'll jump in for answering this too. So there's, like Tracy was just talking about, there's so many ways to get involved with climate justice at the grassroots, and there's so many organizations here in the Northwest that are doing this work. I think about Front and Centered and SAGE, and even just within your own sphere of influence, right? Any group that you're already part of could be a grassroots climate justice organization. I'm working with a girl who's in the Girl Scouts, and she's going for her cadet, some of her badges, and she did a podcast interviewing climate justice activists. And now she's working on her next badge, and she's creating curriculum with her high school science teacher and her social studies teacher to weave climate justice and come up with a week-long project with her teacher that's going to be taught at her school. And so anywhere that you are can be a community climate justice engagement.
And I guess I would just add in, artists have the opportunity to sort of create community through the work that we make, and through inviting people to view that work. So there's a couple programs, one that's a little less grassroots and maybe one to kind of counter that. There's a program through Recology where they have an artist residency program, and they invite artists to come and have a studio at their recycling center and then make work and then have an exhibition to show that work. And this is a model that is kind of moving up the West Coast. It started in San Francisco, and then Portland had a similar program, and now Seattle has started this Recology program. But there's also places like Seattle Recreative in the neighborhood of Greenwood, which are do a lot of community involvement projects where they create classes, and Seattle Recreative is like a thrift store, but specific for art and craft supplies. So it kind of narrows down what the scope of what you would find there. And yeah, they have lots of great projects and opportunities to engage young adults and children and all different kinds of ages. So.
Thank you, Paula, for bringing it up. Seattle Recreative, they have amazing children's classes there, and you're starting our youth even younger at having a mindset of climate justice and how to move forward through the world is really important. So not only in the curriculum, higher academia, but also looking at daycares and preschools and pre-Ks, and how do we incorporate this information to help build the future for the generations behind us. And that also takes an indigenous approach. We're thinking 3 generations behind, 3 generations ahead, and now we're only 1 generation right now that we're living in. So continuing this mindset of what we're doing in our communities to help move them forward. And for myself, like thinking grassroots, it starts with like your values at home as well, and how you know, what identifying what it is to shop in a grocery store compared to going to a farmer's market, and having children understand that underlying theme and responsibility and accountability that we have as an adult, but also feeding that to our children to help them build their own futures.
I should just note for the people who are watching this later, we didn't skip question 3. My answer to question 3 would have been redundant to what I said in question 2. So apologies for the little discontinuity there.
Thank you, Tracy, for that clarification. Anything else we want to talk about the grassroots level of climate justice before we move to the next question? This will be our final question, question 5. So why is incorporating climate justice into STEAM, science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics curriculum important? Why does this hold value? A lot of individuals look at STEAM and STEM as separate entities when they're really all inclusive. And so STEAM is where we're at now.
Okay, thank you. Right. So I didn't know if anybody else wanted to take a crack at this first. I keep talking so much. You guys want to go?
Go for it. I'll follow up.
Okay. Well, you know, one thing for me is basically very personal, which is, you know, in numerous studies done of BIPOC students in the STEAM fields, one basically thing that drives those students, and I like to think all students actually, is the ability to give back, to contribute to their communities. And I think this is the reason why this is so important, is the fact that if you needed a motivating factor, if you needed something that you could care about and that everybody else would also care about, this frames it really well. So that's one of the reasons why I teach what I teach.
And yeah, I mean, I would say that there's so many reasons that I feel really passionate about this. And I feel like I have an opportunity as an educator. You were saying, Shakira, like, you know, we start with our children and we should sort of work our way up. But, you know, I'm seeing students at a whole variety of ages, and this still might be the first time that they hear about that. So I don't want to discredit like a whole population of people, and I have this opportunity to sort of speak to them and to get that as part of their I'm losing the word, but like it's not vernacular, but like to make it part of something that they just automatically think about. And again, you know, starting with really accessible materials makes many more people feel included in the process. Like, oh, I have cardboard, like I could do that, you know, and it just allows people to sort of see themselves in that conversation, maybe if they hadn't before. So yeah, so I just see it as an opportunity to get it in someone's ear if they just haven't had that chance before. So I just take it as a privilege to see as many students as I do, and so try to use that in the different good ways that I can.
Thank you, Paula, for also highlighting that students are in a very important population, but it doesn't only start at young children. That's like the only time that you can do it, that you can start at any phase in your life and hop on to help, you know, support and advocate and be an activist for climate justice. So thank you for highlighting that.
Yeah, thank you for both of your comments on, you know, the importance of incorporating climate justice into our STEAM curriculum, which includes arts. And I also want to speak to the psychology and the emotions that come up, because, you know, there was a study that came out in Lancet that was polling 10,000 young people, and young people feel betrayed by the adults, by the leaders. It's coming, you know, the data is there. And rightfully so, right? Carbon dioxide levels are still going up. And so I think about the work that we're doing, and it makes me think about something that happened in my own home. I have a teenager who is feeling some of those same anxieties and uncertainty around the world. And for them, they said, yeah, I'm losing sleep over my exams in high school, and had a conversation with a friend. And the friend said, oh no, I'm not losing sleep over exams. I'm losing sleep over climate change and the things that she had been learning. And my child asked them, well, or that child asked my child, well, aren't you losing sleep over climate change? And my daughter said, no, my mom is working on that. And the idea that, that an adult in her life is doing something about it, and it gives her the freedom to go, okay, I don't have to worry about that because there's someone I trust who's working on that. And so us as educators, I think that we have the trust of our students, we have the trust of the people that we are working with to be part of that, right? To help people to hold that, right? It's not that she's not feeling it, it's helping her to hold it. And so I think that's a big part of what we also do, even if we're not intending to, just by talking about it, by giving attention to it.
Thank you, Heather. And I appreciate all of you holding space and having the ability to hold space for these conversations. They're not the most comfortable conversations to have. They're important conversations to be had, though, and figuring out what we do next, like what's the next step, and not just having discussions about it, but taking action. Like, what are our action steps? So the last thing I want to leave with before we close the panel is, if you all could give one action item for our audience members to engage in. And we've already talked about the discussion, so that's off the table. So start the conversation, but what are the next steps that we can do for action involvement?
Well, somebody asked me about the city council connection to basically all this. And my one action would be, there's always a public comment period before every city council, no matter where you live in the state. And the point is, use that 3 minutes to drive home your point about what you think the city or its residents should be doing to work on climate mitigation, climate resilience.
I'm gonna yes and what Tracy said. We're right in the middle of session right now. We've got a short session in our legislature, and there are so many bills in the House and in the Senate in our state that are related to climate. Even things about increasing density near transit and decreasing sprawl, that's climate action. And that's climate justice and environmental justice. So, and what Tracy was talking about, speaking, testifying, you don't even have to speak out loud. You can send in an email. I was just looking at Twitter, and Joe Fitzgibbons was talking about how, hey, he's putting forward this legislation, but he needs his constituents to back him up. He needs to have the ammunition of people saying, I want this, in order for him to bring these things forward. So we need to not just push back on our leaders that aren't doing climate action, but to support the leaders that are bringing it forward so that they can do what needs to be done. Because right now, even they aren't doing enough, right? We have to completely eliminate the use of fossil fuels in our world, and we're not even close. We're still increasing carbon dioxide. We need to bend that curve and eventually get to zero emissions, not just cut down on your smoking from 10 packs to half a pack, right? You need to quit. And we got to do the same thing with fossil fuels. So that was more than a sentence.
That's okay. That's a great point, that we also need to help support the leaders that are out on the front line, not just the individuals behind the scenes, but in legislation, because that's where, policies get changed. That's where the Constitution gets changed. All of the legislative and bylaws that Deepa had spoken about in the beginning of the panel, that's where the change can be pushed further than just staying at a grassroots level, community level. We need to have a seat at the table within legislation of individuals coming into these seats. So thank you for bringing that up.
I think I forgot the question, but I'm left. So
I can help you, Paula. So what is one civic engagement or action item that you will leave our audience members with to engage in climate justice?
Well, this feels sort of like a big drop, and I also don't quite know the answer to it. And I talked to Heather about this in one of our meetings where I was trying to figure out what to do. And I was like, I feel like I should talk to my students about NFTs, my art business students, about the art world is sort of being really shaken and rocked by these non-fungible tokens, which is like selling art through cryptocurrency. And I was just like, but I don't know a lot about it. And Heather was just like, that's okay. You don't have to be the expert. You can just like give it to them to research. But I was like, I'm going to maybe sit on it until I just sort of know a little more. And in that time between that conversation passing, I have seen so many artists jump on the NFT bandwagon, and it's just sort of like breaking my heart. It is, the working with cryptocurrency is just a huge energy generator. Like it takes so much energy to make this money, but artists are like, I want to get on the bandwagon, and they're just not aware of the sort of baggage that's attached to it. So it's made me realize I need to put that out there in the world, and I need to talk to my students about it, even if I'm not an expert and I don't understand all the inner workings. I need to start talking about it more so that people are making more informed decisions when they do decide to do it or not to do it, and then or how to participate in that. So that's my big drop, is just start thinking about NFTs or no NFTs. So
Paula, you bring up a good point too, of just even the little nugget piece of information that we can implant, like planting the seed. We don't have to have the tree already grown and the fruit bearing and all of that. Just planting the seed will inspire others to dig further of like, well, what is this NFT? Like, I don't even know what that acronym stands for. Well, okay, let me Google that. And then it leads them down this rabbit hole, but that inspiration of coming from someone that they admire and trust, and that's in a position to like, here you go, here's all of the things that I know, and I'm not an expert, but I can continue to grow on this. And then we also learn from students coming back, or from individuals coming back, like, you dropped NFT, I didn't even know what that meant. And then I came back with it, and they come back with all the information. So it's this constant exchange of collective information that helps us build a platform to have a larger voice as a community. So thank you for that as well. I just want to thank all of you for coming to today's panel and hanging in there through, some discrepancies that we had early on, which is a great highlight of how we keep forging forward, no matter what happens and no matter who tries to stand in the way. We continue to go through with the climate justice issue and bringing light to it and educating it and creating those actions for people to do. And thank you all for your action invites as well. So our next climate justice panel is Wednesday, April 20th. 2022 from 12 to 1:30. We would love to see you there and have your support. And then the next slide is going to show you the Climate Justice Faculty Institute, where you can sign up. You have a QR code. So if you know faculty that are interested, or you've heard of them, kind of speak about it, or this interest peaking, or maybe it's not. Maybe this is where you plant the seed to bring other individuals in. Sprinkle those seeds all over. We'll water them here and there, and we'll watch the plants grow. And if you have any questions, please contact me. If you would like to be on a panel, or if you have other interests or ideas in climate justice, I'm happy to be a hub for you to contact. So again, thank you so much for your time. I know we all have really busy schedules too, and I just want to appreciate you for everything that you're doing, the talents in your own fields and your personal life as well, and just spending some time with us and our audience members to get this information out and have these conversations. Thank you so much for being here.